Czechast, a podcast in English about Czech and Moravian society, history, culture and economy.
This is Czechast, your podcast in English about all things Czech, and I'm Vít Pohanka. Today's special episode marks the 17th of November, the day we remember the fall of communism in 1989 and the rebirth of democracy in Czechoslovakia. In this episode, I'm not really your host, but rather a guest, because back in 2019 I joined political analyst Jiří Pehe and economist Tomáš Sedláček for a discussion on the state of Czech democracy, which was moderated by Daniela Lazarová, head of the English section of Radio Prague International. At that time, Andrej Babiš was Prime Minister. He later spent 4 years in opposition and now, after winning the elections again, is on his way back to the premiership. If nothing else, this sequence, I think, shows the primary mechanism of democracy, where voters decide who governs, continues to function in Czechia. And that, I believe, makes the 2019 conversation feel even more relevant and interesting today.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you. Today is November 17th. On this day, 30 years ago, students took to the streets to demonstrate against the communist government. The demonstration was brutally suppressed by the security services, igniting massive protests around the country that eventually brought down the communist regime. It was a huge milestone in the country's history and the beginning of a new era. We'll be talking about the heady days of the Velvet Revolution, and we'll be talking about the road we've tread over the past 30 years. My guests in the studio are political scientist Jiří Pehe, economist and writer Tomáš Sedláček, and my colleague, journalist Vít Pohanka, who was one of the student leaders making history in 1989. Welcome to the studio, gentlemen. Vít, if I could begin with you, what are your memories of the Velvet Revolution?
Well, I suppose I should point out or explain first that I was a student at Palacký University in Olomouc, which is a kind of provincial town, some 150 or 160 miles east of Prague. So I wasn't in Prague on the 17th of November, which was Friday. But as most students in those days, because Friday the 17th was just the beginning of a weekend, and at that time we used to travel home to see our parents. So I was following the news. By that time I was already listening to BBC World Service in English, which wasn't jammed anymore in the end of the 80s. I was listening to Radio Liberty or Radio Free Europe in Czech, of course, from Munich. And so I was getting the news from Prague. And the thing that I was worried about was that on Sunday, the 19th of November, when I was traveling to Olomouc, I was afraid that in that small provincial town, no one would, or very few people would know that something happened in Prague, and that most people wouldn't be willing to take part in any protests, or that the society would kind of stay stagnant because it was a small provincial town. To my great surprise, that wasn't the case. When I came to the student hostels where students were staying, there were already, students were gathering, and we decided to go on strike even in Olomouc that following Monday on the 20th of November. And most of the students from the university, Palacký University, agreed with that. And what followed, we elected the strike committees at various faculties that we had. I became a member of the strike committee of the Faculty of Arts, and what followed was a week, probably the most intensive week of my life, I would say, because it was still tense. It's very easy to say today, that everything was basically lined up and that the communism would fall anyway. We didn't know that. we can say from the benefit of hindsight again that already the communist regime had more or less collapsed in Poland because there were free elections, if I remember correctly, in June 1989, where the Solidarność movement led by Lech Walesa won. Communism was more or less gone in Hungary, but Czechoslovakia was still one of the regimes that was surviving. And even though the Berlin Wall had fallen by then, we still kind of felt that communism was a very real thing and that it wouldn't give up. So the first week, I would say, was very intense for me. That's how I remember those days. And I'm very glad that I had the opportunity to live through that and to be active, even in a small town like Olomouc, which wasn't like Prague.
But it was a real chance worth fighting for. And
yes.
If I understand, you were ready to emigrate if it didn't work out.
That's correct. I was in my final year at the university, basically expecting to get my MA in 1990. And I had decided by then that I would emigrate to the West, which again in the late 1980s, traveling was becoming slightly more relaxed and it was possible. So I was determined to leave the country, to leave communism. So for me, it came basically 5 minutes to midnight, so to speak.
How do you feel today about where we are now?
I hate to use the kind of phrase, about a glass that's half full and half empty. There are things that I'm not very happy about. On the other hand, I mean, it more or less the development of my country more or less fulfilled what I had hoped for in those heady days of November 1989. If you asked me in 1989 whether I would expect that the country would be in NATO 10 years later, whether I would expect that the country would be a member country of the European Union or at that time European Economic Community, still in the late 1980s, in 15 years, I wouldn't have thought that it would be possible, and it is possible. On the other hand, I mean, obviously nothing is as kind of rosy as I would like it to be. And I suppose we will talk about that some more. Yeah.
I think that is the general answer that you will get from many people with the half-empty, half-full glass. So they're happy about some things, very unhappy about others. Mr. Pehe, could it be that the expectations, because it was a time of enormous hope and great expectations, were they simply too high? Was it unavoidable that the idealists in politics would be replaced by pragmatic politicians and that there would be a certain degree of corruption and other problems? Were we maybe hoping for too much when people thought, we'll catch up with West Germany within 5 years' time and the salaries will be the same and we'll have the same living standard and so on?
Well, I think it was almost inevitable because look where we came from. It was, of course, a communist regime, 40 years of communist regime. And I'm not sure why anyone in 1990 thought that there was a critical mass of people who would know how to build a system of liberal democracy, a real market economy, a real rule of law. There were no skills to do so. And a lot of what happened in the 90s was just improvisation. Sometimes also bad intentions. And so I'm not really surprised by the fact that there was a lot of corruption, a lot of what we call tunneling, basically asset stripping and things of that sort, and that also the political parties that came into existence were not what everyone hoped for, simply because people stayed away from partisanship and after 41 years of communism. And the parties that were created were small, created mainly from above. And at the same time, they presided over the largest transfer of property in the history of this country, creating in the process new economic actors with which they were very closely intertwined. And in the end, some of them privatized into the hands of these new economic actors. So it is to some extent inevitable. It could have been maybe slightly better, but also I think that we have to be patient, because if you look at literature on the process of post-authoritarian transformation, basically all authors agree that it takes 2 generations to really build a full-fledged democracy, and much of that depends on creating a full-fledged civil society. And so we are somewhere in the middle now.
When you look at how the Visegrad states, group states function today, how they defend their interests and how much they have in common, does that also suggest that we have very similar teething problems and transformation problems?
Yes, we have, of course, what connects us is the communist past and some of the same attitudes that people who were socialized during communism still carry with them. People who spent formative parts of their lives under communism have some of the same mental stereotypes and even when you listen to our politicians' vocabulary very often. But we could also argue that in case of the Visegrad countries, there is a more distant past. Some of the pathologies of the late Habsburg Empire, of its political culture, which we all share, and all we have to do to verify that thesis is to look at Austria, which is in some ways very similar as far as political culture goes to what we see in the four Visegrad countries.
The society has become increasingly consumerist in the past 30 years. Is that the reason why people vote for politicians like Mr. Babiš, like Mr. Zeman, who are likely to put business interests ahead of everything else in decision-making, Mr. Sedláček? Why are people voting for them today, despite the fact that they know that Babiš may have a conflict of interest and so on and so on?
Well, it's a very, very similar thing that's happening in the United States of America. I always judged the development of the transition according to the problems that we had. And we started having standard economic problems, this country, like every other country. Added to that, we now have standard political problems. Refugees was a word that we didn't know. It was an absolutely non-issue, even though we survived a couple of waves of migration from Ukraine and from the former states of Yugoslavia, and we had a somewhat significant Vietnamese community. It never became a political topic. Only now we sort of caught up, if you wish, with the rest of Europe. We are no longer the troublemakers. Interestingly, even the economic situation in 2008 and 2009 was something that was actually Czech Republic was exempt from it. We're one of the few countries in the world that didn't have to subsidize our banking by a single penny from the budget. Greeks have sort of become bigger troublemakers than Czech Republic. United Kingdom has sort of self-inflictedly shot itself in the leg in solving the Brexit problem for 3 years and many years to follow. So I wouldn't say that we are exceptionally consumerist. It's one of the things that we wanted. I think the economy is doing. Of course, I agree that it could have been much better. On the other hand, of all the post-Soviet countries, we are doing the best. We have 90% of GDP per capita in purchasing power. Slovenia was always close to catching us up, but it never really did. And we, in terms of economics, we're doing better than Greece, and we will soon catch up with countries such as Portugal and Spain. And we were able to borrow at a lower interest rate than Italy, and Italy was and still is a Euro country. So, objectively speaking, I look at it as a form of waves. We had very idealistic, exceptional presidents, such as Havel, and we seem to got a little bit tired of being the good guy, and now I think we're seeing a downward part of the cycle, and who knows, maybe after 7 years we'll be able to produce something outstanding again.
Can I have just a little note on that consumerism kind of phenomenon? Yes. Recently, I was actually producing a radio program, about the record numbers of visitors to historical sites in the Czech Republic, to theaters. Just try to get a ticket to a theater in Prague. And what I'm trying to get to is that, okay, we might be living in a consumption-oriented society. But what gives me hope is that, there are so many families, so many people going to historical castles. It's difficult to get a ticket to a theater. Theaters are full, hopelessly full. I mean, here in Prague, if I didn't know a director of one of them, I would probably never get a ticket, And
under-the-counter ticket.
Yeah. So I think, there's another kind of more positive side to how the society lives. I don't know if other co-debaters would agree.
I think the motto of Forum 2000 held recently was the need to recover the promise of 1989. Do we need a moral authority like Václav Havel was, or even like Masaryk?
Well, I'm not sure that such a moral authority is easy to find because Havel was, just like Masaryk, by the way, was a product of very specific historical conditions. He was catapulted to presidency by certain circumstances which will not be repeated. And Havel quite often said, I still remember his discussion with Bill Clinton, where he told Clinton, look, you prepared to be the president since the age of 6, and you worked on it, and you are the product of the American political system, whereas I, at the age of 50, didn't know that I would be the president. I simply became the president because of history, and I think it was very much true. So I'm not sure we can bring we can have politicians like Havel or Masaryk again. And maybe it's not necessary because those kinds of politicians are products of revolutionary times.
How did we manage to come to terms with our communist past? Because there are still people saying that maybe the Communist Party should have been abolished. Others saying, no, it was better to let it leave the scene in a democratic way. What do you think?
It's actually quite interesting that it's 30 years after the revolution and we're still talking about communism, and that just alone is significant. If you actually look at it, it's not difficult math. The First Republic, which was the interwar area, very significant for us Czechs. It's a period that we sort of maybe even fetishized in terms of it being ideal. That lasted for 20 years. And I don't think there was, that much of a past Austro-Hungarian discourse as we have today. I think what we should have done is we should have called, or those people who were actually guilty of trespassing against their friends and cooperating with the secret police, they should have said quite loudly, please forgive us, we are guilty. We should have had this sort of night of getting all the bad out. This didn't happen. I don't think we should have banned the Communist Party. This would be something that is against the idea of my idea of democracy, but it was a sensitive topic. But the fact that we are still talking about communist heritage 30 years, it only lasted, it lasted 40 years. So right now we are between 20 years of First Republic and 40 years of communism. I think it's just about time to stop blaming something that a whole generation knows nothing about and started looking in the future rather than trying to find blame that happened 30, 40 years ago.
So how did we handle the economic challenges that we faced in 1989? Because obviously you had a centrally planned economy, so there was a need to liberalize prices, find managers for companies, a million things. How did we handle that?
Well, let's just say that we managed. It was a very difficult process. There was really no cookbook on how to do it. And it's actually quite interesting because our market democracy, the way we call the Western system today, we sort of managed to export only half of it. We managed to export capitalism to China, to Russia, all over the world. Capitalism was sort of exported very successfully. Democracy, not so much. In fact, if you look at it and want to be a little bit brutal, you can say that we've sort of westernized the East when it comes to the economy. But when it comes to politics, it's rather easternization of the West. Anyway, that's how some of the new populist politicians and moods seems to us. So the capitalism as such, if we think about the end of history, finding the perfect system, which was a big topic in the 90s. Capitalism managed to conquer the world, democracy not so much. If it'd be up to me, I'd rather it be the other way around.
Mr. Pehe.
Well, I also think that creating a democratic system of liberal democracy is a process that doesn't take 2 years or 5 years. It really is a long process, as Raoul Dahrendorf warned us already in 1990 in his famous essay, A Letter to a Polish Friend. And I think the reason for that is that democratic system is based on institutions and procedures on the one hand, and it also requires a certain democratic culture on the other. And to create that other part is a much slower process because certain values have to be internalized, certain ways of behavior. And I think that our main problem still is in this regard that we have still, as for example the presidential election showed here, about half of our society, which basically is post-communist. And those people were, as I said, formed by certain values and ways of thinking under the communist regime, and it's very difficult to change. Plus, of course, it's difficult for them to totally renounce the past, as we saw recently during the funeral of Karel Gott, when we saw this outpour of emotions. People wanted to be connected with the past before 1989. So it's a very complex thing. And one of the books I wrote, I called "Democracy Without Democrats," which of course is based on Masaryk. And I think this is our main problem, that we still have a critical mass of people who are not Democrats. We have institutional, procedural democracy that is all in place, the facade, so to speak, but we don't have still enough people who sort of give this, as Tomáš says, the blood circulation, that civil society is the blood circulation of democracy, which distributes oxygen and nutrients. So it is perhaps a generational process as well, and we'll see. But at the same time, I agree with Tomáš Sedláček that we can see problems for democracy everywhere in the world. And so this system of liberal democracy that we hope to create is a moving target, because the paradigm of it has changed after 1989. It's been changing in the West as well.
Have we come as far as you'd hoped to see us come 30 years later? Have we got the institutions that foster democracy, education for young people, and so on?
Yes, I think that given the circumstances, we have gotten where we perhaps, in my opinion, should have been. Maybe it could have been slightly better in some areas, and at the same time, I am surprised that we are doing better in some areas than I thought we would. So it's half and half. And I would say here that I think what really is important is the external framework, that we were very lucky to be surrounded by countries that promote democracy, that help us, the European Union, NATO, and other international institutions, which was not the case for Czechoslovakia before World War II. Czechoslovakia was the last surviving island of democracy in Central Europe, surrounded by totalitarian and authoritarian states. And here we have some problems with democracy, but we are surrounded by countries which promote democracy, and I think that is extremely important.
Do we let ourselves be helped?
Well, a lot of politicians resist. For them, it would be better to operate in this twilight zone. But I think that in many ways they don't have a choice, because our economy depends so much on Europe that if they go too far, they would damage the economy, and that would damage them in the end.
Vítek, as a journalist, what are the threats to our society in the present day?
You mean what are the threats to the free...
For instance, is press freedom...
I might surprise you by saying that I actually think that the press in the Czech Republic is doing quite fine, and that's what I say based on my experience from Poland, where I happened to be a correspondent for a few years, where the public media basically became the state media, and the same thing happened in Hungary, the same thing, not to such a kind of violent extent, happened in Slovakia. And, we are now talking in the Czech National Public Radio, so to say, and I think that public media are doing quite fine and are still able to withstand the attack of some politicians, I would say.
What about fake news, for instance?
But that's a different issue.
I'm not talking about the media now. I'm talking about populism, fake news. What are the things?
But that's something that you can see everywhere. It's not just the Czech Republic. You can see that in the United States, where I happened to have a chance to be. I mean, in the past few months, it's kind of, that's what frightens me much more. I mean, that people kind of, whatever they think, for example, about Donald Trump, whether they are supporters or whether they are opponents, I mean, they kind of close themselves into this virtual reality of people who are, thinking in the same direction, and they live their life there, whether they like Trump or dislike Trump. There's not much of a discussion, there's just shouting. But the shouting actually happens on the social media. It doesn't happen in the streets like it did, for example, in the case of the United States in the 1960s because of the war of Vietnam, etc. And what frightens me, I mean, that it's becoming this kind of new thing that we don't know what to do with, we journalists. I mean, just look at Donald Trump. I mean, he communicates via Twitter, yeah, and that's it. I mean, there's very few press conferences. I mean, there's no real challenge. It's a new media reality, but it doesn't concern only the Czech Republic, only the post-communist geographical area. I think this is a global new phenomenon that we don't know what to do with.
Yeah, look at Great Britain, which is an exemplar democracy, which technically, by the way, isn't a democracy; it's a kingdom. Which I always like to say that countries who have the name democracy written in their names, such as China and North Korea, China actually has it 2 times. People's Republic is twice repetition of the same thing. But in England, they actually don't really know whether they have a parliament in session or not. It seems that their democracy has sort of run into a blunt edge that they don't know what to do when Parliament evidently doesn't want to do a Brexit or is trying to complicate the Brexit while public poll is slightly in favor. That's something that has a real problem for democracy, and we actually technically don't know what to do with it. But on the other hand, I'd say that we've run out of new ideas. I think that the last, and this is your topic much more than mine, but if you look at the last politician who had some sort of a vision, I think it was Tony Blair with his Third Way, but which wasn't super duper original, but at least it was something new. Since then, we haven't had very many politicians who came up with some sort of a new vision. So there's no surprise that many countries sort of want to revert back. In England, it was let's take back control. In the United States, it was let's make America great again. And even here, when 30 years ago we were returning back to Europe. So this sort of notion of going back to a system that we've already seen is a punishment for nothing new in the world of politics. You can also see it in the world of music. Actually, since the 90s, there hasn't been a new musical genre. I've checked this many times. It seems quite paradox. Also in the area of dancing, nothing new. The only symbolic musical instrument that is new since the 90s is the mixing board, which I think is a perfect symbol of politics today. We take old tunes and we just remix it again. So, and also in terms of economics, we haven't had any great economists such as, I don't know, Friedman or Keynes or Hayek since 90s. And I would even dare to say that in the area of perhaps philosophy or humanities as such, there hasn't been any great new movement. The only great movement that we have is this green movement. But otherwise, when I was young, I remember we had hippies, we had anarchists, we had punks, we had communists. Those were very lively youth organizations, and today we have sort of hipsters, which there isn't really anything new in to fill democracy with new hope. We don't really have somebody who has a finger to point. European Union, the only game in Europe which we played, is also in a very dire need of having new direction. So one way how to look at it is that the crisis that we're experiencing in democracy is a vertigo crisis from actually fulfilled dreams. We had very nice democracies for 20 years, reasonably good. And now, because there was no vision, nothing to make people go forward, and then that's why, in my reading, the populist, easy-sounding politicians. To me, a populist is a person who said, I only want your voice, I don't want you to do anything else, don't change, keep the same, give me your voice, and don't speak after you give it to me. Whereas a true politician wants to not take your voice, but talk with you throughout these 4 years and change the population if the country wants to change. But the easy solution populist, I think, just to reiterate, one, because on our side of the game, we have had no new vision.
Are we learning the lessons that can be learnt from what we see, from Brexit, for instance? Because here in the Czech Republic, you don't have many politicians. In fact, I can't think of any that would speak in positive terms about the European Union. We tend to be defensive with regard to the EU. We seem to be following all these trends, like non-traditional politicians and so on. Are we learning the lessons from other countries, or do we just go and make our own mistakes?
I'm an economist, and I think the basic belief of an economist should be in cycles, that things go up and down. And during the good times, we shouldn't forget that bad times are coming, and during the bad times, we shouldn't forget that good times are coming. I think people will be, maybe in 7 years, sick and tired of fake news, sick and tired of people who can only blame others, sick and tired of arrogant politicians who can only insult, and there will really be a sincere demand for people with a difficult but doable vision.
I would argue that, Tomáš Sedláček mentioned that there's really nothing new in music and dance and many other areas, and even politics and economy. But I think there is something profoundly new and revolutionary, and that's in technologies and science.
Yeah, that's right.
That is something that is happening under the surface, but it has political consequences, which are, of course, we are very slow to see them because they come with delay. And so I think that while we are talking here, hundreds, probably thousands of new discoveries were made, and which will profoundly affect us in many ways. And this is the revolution of our times, and it is changing everything, even politics. And I think that we should think more about this dimension. The ethos of this period is there. That's why I'm also an optimist. I think that these forces below the surface, which are driving modern societies, are working towards integration, more integration, because they need it to be productive. And that's why I think that all of these pathological things that we see now, nationalist populism, a certain renewal of racism, and all of these attempts to go back in time, to reset the clock, so to speak, are just doomed in the medium run.
I really like this comment because it's true. In technology and science, we're seeing exactly the opposite of the still waters in the areas that I named. And I just want to say that it's quite interesting that this political disintegration that we see within Europe, we also see it from America, from Trump, goes hand in hand with a unprecedented integration of the world through internet. I can now be much closer friend with a Chinese peasant who happens to like the same music than with my neighbor who's been born next to me. So there's a very strong paradox, and the issue is that we are being driven by technologies who are not here to change the society. So it's sort of politicians. I think this would be a fine new topic. A new blood for democracy would be, okay, let's start dealing with technology and let's try to do politics somewhat scientifically. And this would be also something that would help fake news. I also think this is it's a sort of birth pains of an integrated world. Theoretical physicists speak that in about 100 or 80 to 100 years, this planet should turn into a civilization type 1, meaning planetary civilization, that we will start having a planetary debates, planetary democracy. And it already has. In terms of technology, we have one mind when it comes to internet. We're now connected. I know exactly what's happening in a small Japanese village. I know it like a Jedi. In a second, I know that there's an earthquake in Japan. So it's quite an interesting paradox that the world is integrating, and yet in politics we seem to be disintegrating.
I would just like to point out, as a parent, having teenage children, that what is maybe one of the disappointments that I will have after 30 years of building democracy in the Czech Republic is the educational system, which hasn't developed, and I'm talking basically about the elementary schools and maybe secondary schools as well, not so much about the universities, colleges, etc. That's quite stagnant in my experience. And why I mention that, because when we talk about how the planet is becoming kind of one, and you can see that, young people can communicate on same subjects, whether they come from Asia, from Europe, from the United States. I don't think that the educational system is adapting to that. And probably, some kind of media literacy courses would be needed. I know it's hard to change a system like that, but that would be one of my disappointments. That the educational system has remained rather conservative and stagnant in this respect.
But I would argue that because of their easy access to technologies, communication technologies, our kids are ahead of the educational system in many ways. Yeah. They find the information and even context that they need. I would also maybe point to another thing which is really hopeful, and that's that these new technologies contribute to the spread of certain values which go beyond the boundaries of the Western civilization. And I think that just now we have seen demonstrations and protests in most unlikely places, which are driven by ideas which originated in, which you can find in the Declaration of Independence of the United States. We are all created equal, all men are created equal. And you have people in Lebanon and Chile and places like that demonstrating by hundreds of thousands for these values, for emancipation. And so I think that something is going on which is tied very deeply with these easier ways of communicating and the spread of certain technologies, and in that regard I am very optimistic.
It's like the world of technology is sucking so many things from our real life. It also seems that it's sucking out innovation. Yeah. We sort of minimize the innovation to science and technology. Other areas seem to be somewhat leaping behind, perhaps just like our education system.
Well, it's good to be able to end on a positive note that there is reason to hope things will get better and better. Gentlemen, thank you very much. My guests in the studio have been economist Tomáš Sedláček, political scientist Jiří Pehe, and journalist Vít Pohanka. Thank you so much for your time.
You've been listening to Czechast, and I'm Vít Pohanka. I believe that this conversation from 2019 reminds us that even in turbulent times, the essential mechanisms of a democratic system still depend on voters and peaceful transitions of power. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back next time with a regular next episode. Stay safe, stay healthy, and as we say in Czech, naslyšenou.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.